Okay, so welcome everybody to our next topic of study, and that is the Second World War, or otherwise known as World War II. And this is our first part, and today we're going to talk about some of the backgrounds and the causes of World War II. So America, these are our big questions here. Why was America socially, economically, and politically reluctant to get into World War II? What prompted us to join? What happened in our society as a result of being a part of World War II back home? What about dropping the A-bomb? Was this necessary? What happens as a result of World War II for America and the rest of the world? And was World War II a good war? So these are some of our main ideas today. We're going to look at a pre-World War II timeline, so the things leading up to the conflict, a little bit of geography, kind of the major nations and leaders, and the 8 causes that I'm going to cite as the things that start World War II. You can see below. So our timeline really starts to kind of ramp things up, but way in the beginning, even before the 30s, although the 30s is going to be our focus area, is Mussolini gains power in Italy as not necessarily a complete dictator, but eventually will become one. In 24, Stalin will take power in the Soviet Union. All these guys we'll talk about. The Great Depression begins in 1929, and that'll really kickstart the rest of it. But Japan invades this place called Manchuria, basically northern China, in 31. FDR becomes president in 32. Hitler becomes what's called chancellor, but essentially the next step for becoming the leader of Germany and turning it into Nazi Germany. Congress begins to investigate World War I. This is often a critique of America, that we were in it for the money, that companies promoted us joining World War I as a result of making money. So we'll pass a series of neutrality acts over 3 years to kind of clarify our position as world events begin to unfold. FDR is elected again. Like most presidents, or some presidents, he's elected twice. The Spanish Civil War erupts in Spain, and essentially along communists and fascist lines. We'll talk more about that. There's a different name for it, but for our purposes. Italy will invade Ethiopia and in Africa as a kind of a demonstration of their aggression. Japan will invade mainland China in 1937. Germany will take part of what's called Czechoslovakia, and Hitler will be appeased by a guy named Chamberlain. Germany will annex Austria. The Germans and the Soviets will sign a non-aggression pact, basically saying we won't attack you if you don't attack us. And Germany will invade Poland. This starts World War I. And so some other events that are close by is, one, FDR is elected for a 3rd time, which is unprecedented among American presidents. Additionally, Germany will conquer all of Western Europe, and then the United States will start to begin to act in a little bit more aggressive ways, putting an embargo or trade, a stop of trade on Japanese goods. The U.S. will begin then to give goods to our allies or people we want to support, and then it all comes down as America is attacked at Pearl Harbor. We declare war on Japan, and then as a result, Germany and Italy declare war on us. So kind of a timeline. We can see it kind of pacens. The pace gets quicker as we get further down the timeline. So also some names and some leaders we should be familiar with. So the United States will have Roosevelt for the majority of the war, although he'll die, and the Vice President Truman will take over. For the Soviet Union, Stalin will be our main man for the entire war. The French will have an interesting experience because their nation will be occupied and fall to the Germans, but de Gaulle will be kind of the leader of France in exile, although there's another guy who kind of tries to vie for his power, and Churchill will lead the British during the war. And on the Axis side, obviously most famous, probably among all of these guys, is Adolf Hitler will lead Nazi Germany. The guy Benito Mussolini will lead fascist Italy, and Tojo is the Prime Minister of Japan, although he'll lose his job once the war starts to go south, but he helps plan and execute most of the war for the Empire of Japan. And this is a list of countries. The underlined ones kind of represent the major powers, and then certainly there are other countries. So this is a global war for sure. And there's a map. We'll talk more about this in class, but just so you get a picture of kind of where these places are. But certainly by size, the Allied powers had considerably more. But we'll see the war was not decided necessarily by size alone. It was close, to put it lightly. So our first cause of World War I is the Treaty of Versailles. Essentially, harsh punishments for Germany. They had to pay a bunch of money back, and we can see that it really ruined the German economy. And so this will cause some long-term bitter resentment against the Allies, in particular European powers like France, and to a lesser extent the British. The second cause of World War II is the Great Depression, or the Worldwide Depression. We can see over there on the chart that German unemployment spikes way higher than either the United States or the British, and really this puts a lot of stress on nations, in particular nations that were weak from World War I. So the British and the French were reluctant to spend money on foreign policy and on their military and wanted to focus on their nation instead, and dictators emerge as people kind of trade political control for the promise of economic prosperity in some European nations. Additionally, there's this rise, like I said, of dictatorships, or what we'll call kind of two different versions. There's totalitarian states. All of these represent that, a country which your rights are not really viewed as important, but the nation is more important than you. And fascism will be a unique niche in that, and that holds that the military runs the government and is largely based around racism and nationalism and some support from the business community. So you can see kind of the breakdown of the different types down and below with the flags. The next one is isolationism. Simply the United States chose not to engage the rest of the world. For the most part, after World War I, we wanted to keep our distance, but in particular, during the Great Depression, our focus was on domestic policy or issues at home with the New Deal. And the perception of a lot of Americans was that World War I didn't solve anything. It actually caused more problems. So us getting involved didn't fix anything. This cartoon, you might recognize the artist. Down at the bottom, Dr. Seuss actually has quite a bit to say about war and the leaders of the Axis powers. We'll look at some more Dr. Seuss cartoons a little bit later on. Additionally, we signed a bunch of pacts or agreements or treaties, so we can see kind of the long list, but essentially the Locarno Pact says we're not going to fight each other. These European powers, the 4, 5, and 9 power treaties essentially limit nations' military. Specifically, the Navy was of concern, also called the Washington Conference, and probably the most famous is the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and this makes war illegal. But the catch is there's no enforcement. How do you stop somebody from going to war if you're not willing to go to war? So, and pacifism is this idea of just opposing war in general, as it's unjustifiable. The next one is false security. So the French are probably the most famous for this, although other nations could be cited for having a false sense of security. But essentially the French spent the time between World War I and II being prepared, or so they thought, and they built this elaborate system of defenses called the Maginot Line. Essentially, you can see the map there. It covers all the distance between, or most of the distance between Germany and France, and it was this series of forts and guns and bunkers underneath, and it was really elaborate, although the Germans stole all the plans, so they kind of knew what was where. But we'll see that fortifications that are static, meaning they don't move, are less helpful to defend one's nation. Additionally, like I said earlier, inaction and appeasement will be the methods of the Allies, and it's pretty ineffective. So the world powers really begin to kind kind of turn a blind eye to disregarded treaties, and as aggressive nations expand their land, and they even give in sometimes. This is what's called appeasement, so it's conceding some things to avoid a bigger problem. Most famously in 1938, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, comes home a hero. He says, "We now have peace in our time. Her, Hitler, is the man we can do business with." Essentially, Hitler promised, "I won't do anything more as long as you give me this land," and obviously that was not successful. And then the last, this is kind of a repeat of World War I, but we see a strong rise in nationalism again among these nations, a renewed sense of militarism, and a new form of alliances. We'll call them the Axis this time, so Italy, Germany, and Japan. So this is going to cause some problems. Additionally, the international organization that was there to create peace, the League of Nations, really was not effective. They didn't control any major conflicts. They didn't help with getting rid of guns. They didn't have a military force, and there were missing powers like the United States. You can see there, countries will leave who will see as maybe the bad guys or the less than desirables around the world, like the Soviet Union or Germany eventually. Italy and Spain will drop out, and the Japanese. If it's a world organization, not everybody's in, and so this causes some problems. And so this is a review of our main ideas. Hopefully, looking at this, you can kind of be familiar with some of those and some of those terms that we defined. Guys, have a good one. I will see you later.